just to also look at, just the speed. So what we are looking at doing is, if I look at this side, this is the unit that we started last time. And what we did was, we an overview of the unit, which was understanding, did I email this to you?
No, I don't think so. I haven't got any.
I'll send it to you now, because if you recall, the last session that we did was, what we looked at was an overview of how tourism, the nature of these, because of increased mobility, the world becoming a global connectivity, through not just the sea routes, which was connectivity now through airlines, rail routes, even, the development of road infrastructure, which allows people to travel to different countries through the road route, has made, tourism now a leisure activity. So it's a very important activity in everybody's calendar in terms of the year. So apart from looking at, understanding the various aspects of what we have studied so far in terms of the main we want to look at now is, so we've looked at, basics of tourism and planning, how tourism industry works, what are the key, trends in terms of planning, how it is evolving, targeting within the travel and tourism industry, in particular, things like the growth of online retailers, online travel agencies, OTAs as we call them, the role of intermediaries. We've looked at how tourism industry has grown from just being a destination to being for leisure, for events, for activities which are like seminars and conferences, which can also happen in locations wherein, it becomes a corporate affair. Then we looked at some bits and pieces of how technology has come into the industry. With the advent of internet, what we've seen is that, it's easier for users to get information about various destinations. There is comparison possible because of certain sites. And, the availability of internet has also created a channel wherein it's like a middleman between the destination, the provider, like the tourist hotel or, the leisure activity or the event, but also the consumer. So in between, you have the internet wherein they have the ability to be able to, kind of do tracking on prices, comparisons, look at roles, booking. All this has become automated because of technology. Now, preferences can also be recorded because technology helps the integration of, server ticketing softwares like Abacus, other softwares which hotels today employ, loyalty card schemes. They have all become possible because of the advent of technology, wherein, all this information of when you visit a hotel or when you go to a particular destination, your preferences, your requirements can be tailored. And every time you go there, these loyalty schemes kind of note these preferences down, and then they serve up these kind of offers and, particular tailored options when you want to go across on holiday. So technology, we looked at the role of technology in terms of how it has shaped the, tourism and hospitality industry in general. And because of technology now, lots of things which were not possible, have become possible. And predominantly it is the recording of data, which allows, the providers to then customize and offer bespoke services to, people who are looking at traveling for leisure, looking at traveling for official or, commercial purposes. Now we then started on a unit which is called the Tourism and International Development. Now in this particular unit, the whole idea is that we want to be able to understand what is the relationship between, tourism and international development. So as new countries, come online in terms of connectivity, come online in terms of infrastructure development, a lot of people are curious and they want to travel to different parts of the world. So as development within the countries begins to happen, one of the key things that the country tries to attract revenue from is tourism as a destination. So when you look at emerging markets now, like Indonesia, China, India, Brazil, Russia, what is happening is because of the development of infrastructure and because of the availability of connectivity and, these destinations also have a rich historical background. They have archaeological, history in terms of having landmarks and, old, ancient, basically civilization. So a lot of people are now looking at visiting these destinations because it is now physically possible for them to travel. And it's possible for them to travel from an aspect of, not just traveling, but it is safe to travel now. Language is no longer a barrier. And these kind of things which are helping the countries develop are also helping to develop the tourism industry in that country. So what we want to be able to understand with this particular unit is that how globalization, which is a phenomenon which has happened in the last 20, 30 years, has actually also driven, favorably factors to promote tourism in various countries and, geographies. So we have looked at in the initial presentation when we started an overview of this unit, what we looked at this overview of how globalization is driving tourism in various, various locations. And then we looked at briefly studying, the trends of why globalization, we say has positive effects and why we say globalization has negative effects. So positive effects have been that this industry started to grow, it is creating jobs and things like that. Coming down, there is competition, which basically drives pricing down. The role of industries like the travel agents. There are some negative effects that we looked at because in certain places, what is happening is Egypt's Sharm el-Sheikh. It is a destination which is frequented by 20 million visitors every year. So in that case, that also tends to kind of, have a local negative effect on the environment on that geography because of too much air pollution, pollution in general because of a lot of foreign visitors coming in. So you look at the pilgrimage, Mecca, for example, lots of people go Mecca. So we to all work together to make these destinations are, protected and obviously maintain the heritage. There's a lot of development which happens, in the background, and we looked at some of the negative aspects. And then we looked at what are the drivers which are driving, globalization, and because these drivers are also driving tourism. So economic, technological, demographic, social, and political. If you look at Burma, for example, Burma was, has been largely closed from the rest of the junta rule, but because of the Aung San Suu Kyi coming in and the democratic process starting, to tourism as a country is primarily being driven through the political side of events happening in that country. Now, if you look at demographic would be like if you look at Middle East, used to be very much closed society, but because now a lot of development is happening in the Emirates, in Qatar, in Kuwait, and in Saudi Arabia, demographically you will see a lot of visitors are now going to Dubai because of the nature of the destination, and also the demographics typically mean that a lot of young crowds, say for example, go to places like, if you look at the Canary Islands or Majorca, these are destinations which are classified on the basis of demographics also. So age, your sex, obviously looking at your preferences, it is considered as a destination for mostly young tourists, or tourists which are between the age group of 25 to 35, party going tourists. Technology, so all these things is what we looked at the brief overview, and then some of these factors were and discussed in individual slides. So basically, this was kind of an introduction or an overview of I would say how tourism is growing because of internationalization, or basically because of international development or globalization, as we call it. So today we are apart from basically understanding the overview of the which we did last time, but today what we're going to do is delve into just the first learning outcome, which basically, and I'll send you this presentation, the first learning outcome which talks about basics of how does what is the phase of development happening across the development, what drives it, what are the theories, and things like that. Format this a bit later, no problem. So here what we are looking at is we are studying a bit of history, which is to understand the theories or theoretical approaches of the concept of development. How does development in general happen? When development happens, how does it kind of in terms of shaping up the economy, shaping up the job sector, shaping up things like the facilities, infrastructure, all these things. So the idea here is, if I look at to evaluate theories of international development. So here we are looking at studying the basic theories of Keynesian theory. There were some scientists which basically some what do you call the developmental models, and these models, when they were talked about, were basically models which show us a growth phase which has happened all over the world in 3 or 4 different decades. So when you look at industrialization, predominantly what happened was, when we look at industrialization, in the early 19th century, everything started to become modernized. We did not have, facilities like the refrigerator, the bulb. So all the inventions typically happened during the industrialization era. After the industrialization era, we had another era, which is post the Second World War, and that era was classified, as the second phase of development happening in the world as an economy. And the third one was basically neoclassical, which is, something which is happening from the 1980s. The revolt of the labor unions, and, unions came around, and, basically, because of the public sector becoming big, unions came around, and how, the world got past the unionization era. And then the last bit that we look at, the modern era, which is in which the companies started to become global. And obviously, they started to have offices, expansion into other countries to offer similar products and services. So this is the concept of, what we call the concept of development of the world economy. And we try and study this through the theoretical approaches, in order to understand these 3-4 phases of development, and how then countries have adapted. Because of this phase of these phases of development, what has happened is that we have countries which are modern countries, or developed countries as we call them. We have countries which are developing countries, and then we have countries which are underdeveloped countries. And that is where most of the growth and the development is currently happening. So when we look at that, the idea would be to try and understand from a learning outcome one perspective this particular aspect of how internet is happening, and we will relate it to the context of travel and tourism in particular when we discuss this particular learning outcome. Now, in terms of let's start with the basic bit of what is the definition of development. What do you understand by the definition of development?
Development is building some kind of like.
So when we
design or
yeah, go ahead. So when you say development, development is nothing but development is basically 2 words: develop and ment. Okay, so development is like a continuous process as it goes. Developing, development. Now, this is development in short also means, if I look at synonyms of this word, development also means evolution. Development also means growth, right? So from a context of, definition of development in the tourism industry, or in the case of international development, what we will do is we classify development as nothing but a series of events which are happening one after the other, and the occurrence in the, the way in which they occur, it leads to some sort of, better availability of process, say products and services. So an example here would be when you look at, say for example, when you look at in the case of travel and tourism industry, we did not have the internet. When internet came around in 1995, what needed to happen was slowly and gradually all the developments happening within this internet started to make things available through, most of the, if you recall, I don't know, most of the internet when it came about was text-based. It was only data, but you could not see any pictures. After 3 or 4 years of development, then pictures started to appear on the internet, wherein when you could, actually look at internet and look at websites, wherein there was not just static data, but you could have some static images. Then came the advent of HTML in 2000s, and that HTML allowed, images to be integrated in the internet. So this is nothing but how the evolution of internet is happening. And these series of development which are happening, or series of changes happening, is leading to the development of modern internet over the years. And today what we see is, because of fiber being available, you can actually stream video. So if I go back, maybe say 15 years back, there was no concept of something called a video, on as far as what do you call, the internet is concerned. But today it is available because of the development, technological, innovation which has happened in the background. It's classified as nothing but development, and that has basically made available, this particular ability to be able to stream live video on the internet. So as it says, development is a process which is a condition, and it is not static. That means it continuously changes. There are lots of continuous changes or series of events which are occurring, which actually make the particular situation change over a point in time. So it is nothing but a process which is nothing but a series of steps or processes which is dynamic, which leads to a change from state A to state B, and that is how we will define development. Now, let's look at development according to one of the authors. Now, Todaro basically defined development as something which is to do with that it is purely an economical phenomenon. He calls it that the development in the context of international places happens because of purely economic reasons. And this is because if in a certain country the policies are conducive, the political social system is conducive, in the sense it is favorable, then it leads to overall development of the of the economy, the city, the town, or the country. And this particular definition of development is what Taro actually focuses on. And he is one of the renowned he's one renowned economist who basically has done a lot of studies on migration, unemployment, development. And he has then come across with certain theories which basically talk about how the development happens, international development, international development, leading to development in all sectors and phases of economy happens. And according to him, he defines development is not purely an economic phenomenon, but rather a multi-dimensional process involving reorganization and reorientation of entire economic and social system. So when we study certain theories, there will be names of Karl Marx, Todaro, these are key famous figures that will come across, and they have defined, what you call the study of, I would say modern economics, in terms of, how it has shaped up our lives, shaped the lives in terms of the, people, and also how it has led to the phenomenon of modernization in the society. So Todaro basically, he has written a number of books, and these number of books that he's written, he's basically worked across, as a very famous economist in the 20th century. So he's regarded as the renowned figures who has studied, the issues of migration, unemployment, and development in particular, and he's known in this field, from that aspect. So his definition of how international development or development happens, and he defines it as a combination of economic and social system, reorganization of economic and social system. According to him, he also says that development is a process of improving the quality of all human lives with three equally important aspects. So he defined these three aspects as that is development happening in society. When he says, then we can only consider development happening in the society if these three factors are met. First is that it raises the income level of the people in the society. Right? The second factor that he talks about is the growth which these changes create overall benefit all the systems in the society. That is social, political, economic, they benefit everybody in the society. And the third is that he says that because of the development happening, there is an increased choice available to the users of that particular, say, city, town, country because of the case of development happening. So according to him and his theory, when we define development, basically it is based on the three pillars. And these three pillars, if they are these 3 points or pillars, if they are satisfied, then and only then we say that there is development happening in that particular country, geography, town, whatever you call it. So one of them is that it raises the income level. That means if people have more income, they have better prospects of living. They have better consumption in terms of products and services, which could be education, medical services, and services like the public infrastructure. It creates overall good change in the system of the society. So not just political, but social, economic, and other changes which are related to the society also happen because of development. And the third is that it makes a lot of choices available to the people in terms of products and services. So if these three objectives are met, then according to Todaro, what we say is that there is development happening in that particular geography. Now, what we also look at is the alternative interpretation of what he proposed. But there are scientist which is called Mabo Gunje. He basically proposed. He's again one of the economists, and he proposed that development cannot just be classified as just economic growth. And too often, he says that people classify the definition of development and relate it to just the economic growth. But he says, this, according to him, what he says is that there is a persistence of dual economy wherein export sector contains small number of workers but draws technology as compared to traditional sectors where most people's work is dominant by inefficient technology. Now, his view was that he has spoken about that, yes, development brings across economic growth, there's no doubt. But according to him, this at some stage needs to be a growth on various aspects, and it should not be tainted in terms of having development happening wherein the technology tends to drive the growth in that sector. So when you look at an example of, say, the car industry, right? Now, in the olden days when cars were made, most of the robotics or, the automatic welding which happens in the assembly line, production line, paints and, other thing, painting of the bodies and other things happen, they were all done manually by the people. And that is where the jobs and employments basically were kind of sustained and they were like, permanent. But because now the technology is overtaking slowly and its dominance within these sectors are increasing, what is happening is that some of these jobs are being taken over. The traditional jobs done by the workers are being taken over by technology-ridden, machines. So in this case, robotics as an example. So his idea was that, at some stage, the definition of these three pillars of what Todaro had proposed, things like raising people's levels of income, looking at providing choices, and last but not the least, that overall development happening in the society could have a little bit of a negative effect, wherein sometimes what we get to see in certain places, the technology starts to drive the sector, and this traditional sector in terms of where people work and they earn their livelihood and wages, they tend to be dominated by the use of technology in those sectors. Now, forward, what we also look at is the concept of development, the concept of modernization. Now, into the definition, let's understand what is the concept of modernization. Now, when you look at, I gave you an example of how internet came about in 1994, 1995. The concept of modernization is when HTML got integrated into the internet, or the new form of how coding could be done to transmit data came about through the invention of HTML, hypertext markup language, which allowed the integration of images, videos, and other things possible on the internet. Now that was a sea change or a big change for internet to happen, and that is what we will call modernization, right? Now, if you look at, say, for example, a steel plant, and what they look at is, or you look at, say, for example, the tourism industry. Now, let's look at an example of a bed and breakfast, right? A bed and breakfast is a traditional business run by, say, the family. Now, if they look at, and they've been running it for, say, for example, for a number of years. So it is a pub. It also has a bed and breakfast on the first and the second floor, and in the evening they basically have a restaurant and a bar which kind of works and serves the local customers. Now they've been doing this for 20 years. Now the modernization could be that they were serving beers which were served in pitchers or through the pitchers, but at some stage the bar had the ability to be able to have beer being served through the pitcher, but it was through the electronicalized the modernization, which is rather than every time a barrel used to be plugged in to draw the beer out, what happened is the mechanism, the machinery allowed the beer to be sucked from the barrel and then poured into the draft, isn't it? Or an example would be that when you look at within the the bed and breakfast, when they had the rooms, they had the old CRT televisions, cathode ray tube televisions. But with the advent of flat television, when it happened in the early 2000 2010 2005, between 2004 2005, what tended to happen is a lot of these bed and breakfast and hotels, they went through a phase of modernization wherein all the old TVs were replaced and new flat panel TVs were put in. Correct? Yeah. So that is nothing but a phase of modernization. Now, you can currently see that in a lot of 5-star or best of the hotels available across the different places, they are now currently changing these 32-inch or 24-inch televisions by 40-inch or maybe 50-inch televisions. Yeah. Some of them are replacing plasmas with LED televisions because they support the interactivity in terms of being the web browsing television as well. Movies on demand are also available, and you have Sky and other internet television channels also available coming through that TV in the room. So this phase is nothing but modernization, right? So if I had to say in general that a lot of development has happened over the years within the industry in terms of tourism, where you had 1-star hotels, 2-star hotels, 3-star hotels, but modernization is the effect of maybe a new swimming pool being put in. There was a swimming pool earlier, but what they've done is now, because the hotel has grown, they have put in a large swimming, Olympic-sized swimming pool rather than a small pool. So that is the concept of modernization. Is it clear?
Yes, it is.
Right. Okay. So when you look at the, the concept of development, there is one thing which we also study with aspect to that is the concept or development of, or the coming in of modernization, which also enhances development. So here, what we do is we emphasize the process of, something called social change, which is required to produce economic advancement, changes within social, physiological, and political processes. So, for example, in the hotels, the bookings 20 years back were all done manually and through the travel agents. But with the advent of technology coming in, these bookings became, on the spot, could be done over the phone, could be done over the internet, and that is nothing but a concept of modernization.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So here, what we look at is there's a shift which is happening, wherein because of the concept of modernization and the changes which are coming in, sometimes what you get to see is that people have to be put into training and development as well. So if there's a new software being introduced for booking in the hotel, all the staff would have to be trained to use that software so that they are very well aware how to do bookings as against doing bookings, on a manual basis.
Yes.
Is that okay? Yes. Now, the other thing which we relate to this is that as development happens, what has happened is there is a slight bit of improvement which has also started to happen on, something called social justice. Now, in the olden days, if you recall, what used to happen was because the courts were spread across and, people did not have access to, basic facilities of the council and the government. What tended to happen is at some point in time, if you had bought a good and you bought a service, you could not easily complain and, basically get justice or social justice for it. So in some cases, what has happened is the development has also made the prevalence of, social justice available quite quickly. And that is to give you an example that, if you stayed in a hotel and you were not happy with it, there was nothing that you could do. All you could do is lodge a complaint, maybe at the reception, speak to the manager or the owner, and then that's it, But today, because of the concept of development happening, and this industry has become so regulated and so well spread out, what we are seeing is that there are a lot of bodies which have got created, wherein customers, if they are not happy with the service or in terms of products and services, or the services that they're enjoying, if they are not happy with it, they can then go out and also look at getting justice for it, or basically making complaint for it. So centralized body, you know. So this has also led to what you call the concept of development. So because there are lots of products and services available, and from lots of people available, there is a need for a regulator. And when we look at that need for a regulator, what tends to happen is that that's not happy with what you've been providing, you have the opportunity to go out, complain for it. Okay, so this is also an effect of something called modernization. Now let's look at something which is a different concept, which is to look access. Have you heard about Karl Marx?
Karl Marx, yeah, I have.
Right. So Karl Marx was, a very he was basically, he was classified as a philosopher, but he was also an economist, a socialist, a journalist, and he was a socialist in particular. What people remember him about. Now, Karl Marx has come across with a lot of theories during his time frame that he's put forward, and one of the theories that he put forward was the theory of political system. Now, Karl Marx he defined basically the society. Let's put it this way: how the societal system works. Okay. Now, his particular theory, which people remember him about, is a theory that he created, wherein he said there is a class differentiation, which is capitalism and socialism, and that is what he is most renowned for. So when he basically discussed the concept of why are certain countries based on a particular type of philosophy like socialism, or certain countries based on a philosophy like capitalism. And he believed that social classes, basically the society itself kind of dictated, the classification of what kind of country or, context that you lived in. And this concept of social classes is something which is, what he defined under the aspect of what is called the socialist economy, or what is called the capitalist economy. Now, I'll share with you how to read about, because this is one of the, he's a very important person, at least in the post, Second World, basically in the industrialization era, when we look at the mid 18th and 19th century. But in general, these views are still, present and prevalent today. And his view on development, when we look at, is on this slide, which basically talks about he emphasized that the mode of production is basically what we look at in terms of, the concept of development, or the definition of development. He basically defined it as that elements and activities which necessarily produce or reproduce, real changes in our material life. So he says, for me, development is if it brings across a material change in your life. That means if you start, if you are a student, and imagine after completing your education, you get a job and you start working, then it brings across material changes in your life. Because of the stable income that you are getting, it allows you to create or buy products and services, which creates a material difference in your day-to-day life. So, for example, you say finish a course and you appear for a job interview, and after that you get a job, then one of the material changes could be that you might end up getting your own place in terms of rent. You might end up buying a car, or these kind of things are defined as something called material changes. The other thing that he looked at was that when we look at capitalism and we look at socialism, so he defined capitalism as a mode which depends on wage labor, whose labor force produces a surplus. That means there are economies which are called capitalist economies, and there are economies which are called, socialist economies. Now, in the capitalist economy, have you heard about this term?
Not really.
Okay. Now, capitalist economy, when we look at the definition, basically capitalist economy is a system or capitalism is this economic system in which capital goods are owned by private individuals or businesses. So socialism means that the goods and services or the major assets within the country are owned by the government. And capitalist means that there is a fair amount of privatization which has happened, wherein most of the services which are enjoyed by, say, by people in that society could be owned by private individuals or businesses.
Okay.
When you look at UK, we are an example of capitalism, because post the Thatcher era in the 1980s, most of the services like water, rail, electricity, energy, these were all privatized. And we become, rather, let's put it this way, we transition from being a socialist to a capitalist economy. Now, when you look at China, for example, they are still a socialist economies, because most of the major goods and services are within the public remit, are within the remit or the control of the government. So when you look at rail, when you look at the airlines, when you look at, for example, power, energy, water, military, they are all in the obviously in the control of the government. So from that aspect, what we do get to see is that he was a proponent of that there are two types of society, and these two types of society can be divided from, or can be looked at from division from a point of view of what makes them in terms of these societies. So if the goods and services are owned by the government or by the public sector, then it is a socialist economy. And if it is owned by private businesses or individuals, then it is a capitalist economy. Now, his view on development was that, one, it brings across a material change in your life. That means if there is development happening in a place where you live, and you generally find your living standards going up, or there's a material change happening in terms of the real income coming in your hands, then that is defined as development by Karl Marx. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, there is something which is another definition that we look at, and that is something which is called Neo-Colonial dependence model. Now, what is Neo-Colonialism is basically, it is defined as a term which came across when there were a lot of colonies, like the British, the French, the Spanish. They had basically conquered the world, and they had a lot of colonies. Okay. So this term came out of that particular aspect, wherein it was called Neo-Colonial. That means India, for example, was a British colony. If you look at Nigeria, for example, was a French colony. If you look at, say, for example, Algeria was a Portuguese colony. Now, these were states which were dominated by different powers at that point in time. And here, the kind of development which was happening was being shaped by their main economy, or the main country under which they were set up, right? So neo-colonialism means nothing but it means that there is a use of economic, political, cultural, and other pressures to control and influence other countries, especially the colonies. Okay. Now, in the modern context, what we look at is, so there were different types of definitions which Karl Marx and Dos Santos, which is again, our modern day time economist and philosopher, they defined, and they basically said that a lot of developing countries or developed countries have now the ability to kind of control the development of, the economies in developing and underdeveloped countries. So if you look at, let's give you an example of, when you look, say, for example, today, when you see development requirements, electricity or energy requirements. Now, the developed countries, when we look at, like America, UK, France, Germany, these countries are called, these are extremely developed countries, correct? Now, we also have something called the advancement in technology, for example, in nuclear energy, right? Now, if developing countries want access to this particular technology, they can only look at it, getting it in two ways. One is they develop it internally themselves, which will take a number of years to, develop and get to that level, or they can form alliances and obviously look at transfer of technology from these countries wherein this particular technology is already available. How to harness nuclear energy, for example, right? So this particular concept of something which creates a dependence of development from developed to the underdeveloped economy, from somebody who has already got it to person who wants to get it, is the concept of something called neo-colonialism. And that model in terms of development is called neo-colonialism dependence model. So here it says, if you read the second point, it says existence of underdevelopment due to historical evolution of an unequal international capitalist system of rich country, poor country relation. So if I look at Africa in general and compare with Europe, what you will see is that Europe is mostly developed and Africa is mostly underdeveloped. Most of the technology and the development now happening in these countries in Africa is being translated from European countries, or say countries which are called developed countries. Correct? And in some cases, what tends to happen is that there is selective development provided by the dominant developed country to an underdeveloped country. An example of this would be that in some cases, what tends to happen is when they look at making money and when they look at doing technology transfer. So, for example, there's a dam being constructed, in say in Africa, in some country. What will happen is if the technology is being transferred over, and Netherlands, for example, which is known to reclaim land and is considered a world leader in water-related technologies, if they go in and do some development within a country, then what they will do is they will not give the latest technology at the first instant to that country. What they will do is they'll start off with a model wherein they'll look at the environment, what is conducive. If electricity is not available, then things cannot be developed at the first instant to the cutting edge. So what they will do is they'll look at phase 1 of development, and after phase 1 is completed, they'll go to phase 2, phase 3. But there would not be a stage where they will give out the latest technology to these countries, because that is where they will want to make money, and they would want this particular country to come back to them again and again for getting the new technology, isn't it?
Yeah.
So this concept is nothing but neo-colonialism in terms of dependence model as far as the development is concerned. So here the elite class, another definition could be the elite class actually controls the development of society overall in terms of definition. So the rich have the power, the rich economies have the power, they have the technology and the whereabouts to be able to control the development in certain countries. Okay, so that is particularly this particular model. To understand development, what's in this concept? Now, what sustainability? Do you know what is the definition of sustainability? Say sustain. Let's look at the definition of sustain or sustainability.
Sustainable is what is strong, developed. I mean, seems to me is right.
So yes, you are correct. But when we look at just the literal definition of the word sustain, sustain means you want to be able to support and maintain something, going forward. That is sustain. Okay. So if, for example, your salary currently on a monthly is £2,000, your main objective is that you want to be able to at least in this salary. If you're getting a promotion or you are not getting higher salary, what you want to is this salary of £2,000. Correct? So that is the word or the meaning of the word sustain. That means you want to support and strengthen what you already have in a way, right? Now, when we look at the concept of sustainability or sustainable development, if I extend that definition, that means that, in the from a point of view of economic development, this is something which is conducted without, depletion of some sort of, natural resource. Or, for example, sustainable development means that it is something that you are able to develop without having a degradation in your current resources. So a lot of countries now, or in a lot of places now, what they're trying to look at is promote the concept of something called sustainable development. Now, you want to develop a particular area or a particular sector, but you do not want that development to kind of create a dip in that when the process of change is happening or when you're undergoing change. Okay, so this particular concept wherein we talk about policies being implemented like climate change is something which is being looked at from a point of view of sustainable development. Now, most governments, most economies, most developed countries do not want to halt their development in terms of growth of technology. But what they want is the growth of technology should not harm or create irreversible damages towards climate, right? Global warming, for example. So cars are increasingly getting better. Engines are becoming more efficient. A lot of people are buying cars now. So if you look at 40 years back, maybe 1 in 20 people or 1 in 50 people had cars. So London, say, for example, in the 1960s, had only 20,000 cars. But today, if I look at the city of London, there are more than 20 million cars in London. So what has happened is, in the concept of sustainable development, what they want to do is they do not want to stop the growth or the development happening, but they want to also at the same time maintain the degradation of natural resources. They do not want the air in the city of London to get polluted. So there's an introduction of this, the charge, which is the charge which you have to pay every time you go to London if you're coming from outside. Congestion charge, as they call it, isn't it? And they are also thinking of now levying a diesel congestion charge on vehicles which are coming in, because they do not want to stop people to come into London, but what they want to do is the money raised from that will actually help in cleaning the air or the environment in and around London by planting more trees or, making the infrastructure much more sustainable, so that people do not want they do not want to drive in. They have the infrastructure available to be coming in through bus, train, or, trams or whatever it is. So the concept of sustainable development is that it meets the present needs without having to compromise on the ability of having those features for future generations. If we do not conserve water today, what will happen is our future generations will not have clean drinking water. So this is the concept of sustainable development. So what they are looking at doing now is that, again, if you look at 3-4 decades back, all the water was straight away being treated, sent into rivers and rivers into sea, and then it was not treated as sewage. But today, everything in terms of water usage is treated by sewage plants. It is neutralized for, pollutants, chemicals, vulnerable diseases, whatever it is, and then that water is let out into the streams, and streams go into the sea. Correct? So the idea is you do not want to prevent people from using water. As long as you can pay for it, you use water. But the idea is the more you use, they want to make it easier for it to be, sustainable without having to degrade the environment. So this concept of sustainable development has become very important in modern countries today, third world countries or third world countries today, because what they're trying to do is the developed countries are now trying to work on a model wherein they do not want to slow down on the growth and the economic development happening, but at the same time they are conscious of the fact that whatever development they bring about should not adversely affect the natural resources of the environment, right? So like deforestation is a major issue now, and I look at deforestation is a major issue because deforestation is leading to creation of weather patterns like cyclones and global, because not enough trees are there, and that leads to higher temperatures. So when you look at this, because of modernization, land being cleared for people to live, development happening, what we tend to see is that this is leading to adverse effect on the natural resources environment, right? So this, for then see, basically you see there was rich forestation. This is an example of Indonesia, Java and Borneo. This particular Philippines, Indonesia, Java and Borneo. This map. Now you see, because of development and globalization happening, these red dots were areas wherein there was heavy and dense forestation. This is a picture taken out in 1990. Now, what has happened over the years is because tourism has become the mainstay of these countries, Indonesia, Philippines, Java, Borneo, these islands, what has happened is it has led to more inhabitation in these areas. And because of more inhabitation, it has led to a large-scale deforestation. And because of the deforestation which has happened, it has led to what you call the increase in temperature, natural, calamities,
Climate
so
change.
climate change which is happening. So this is a real-time effect of what we see in terms of development. Now coming to the modern era. So when we studied Todaro, specifically Karl Marx studied, it was in the 18th and the 19th century. Todaro was basically an economist in the modern era, when we look at the early 19th centuries, when we look at just before probably I would say the World War era. And now when we look at Keynesian, statistics, or he was a very well-known, again, a very well-known economist, and he basically proposed something called the Keynesian model. And this model of economics basically, is a proponent of many theories saying that the economic output basically is strongly influenced by demand. Now, Keynesian growth theory, he is very famous for basically coming out with a lot of theories related to, the economic growth. But in particular, he is known for one of the theories which directly talks about and relates to development, is that basically economic output is strongly influenced by demand and supply. That means if there is growth going to happen within a particular sector or a particular town, city, country, whatever you call it, means in that town, city, sector, there is going to be a strong demand, demand for basically products and services. Overall, there's going to be something which is to do with the fact that there is going to be a strong demand for products and services, because that is something which will fuel what you call the growth in that particular economy or that sector. So in the 1940s and the 50s, he defined, after the Second World War era, wherein a lot of countries went back into rebuilding, their own country's infrastructure. They started with something called the process of capital formation. That means if you see Britain as a country, it had large debt after the Second World War. The country was nearly bankrupt. So what helped drive the modernization in the country was primarily modernization funded by savings and investment by people who had saved up money over the years. And that savings, which were basically kept in the bank, against which government actually gave out bonds and said that, okay, they will be using your savings, but you will have the guarantee that your savings are protected, and long-term bonds were given out, was actually what fueled the growth and the redevelopment of Britain after the post-World War era. So here, what basically he proposed is that at some stage, growth in that particular sector can only happen. The savings are actually channeled into productive investment. Now, have you heard about bonds or yields, which Bank of England issues, or sometimes you will see central banks in different countries, they issue these bonds. Bonds, yeah, government bonds. Yeah. Now this is nothing but this was John Maynard Keynes. The name of the person who came out with this Keynesian theory was John Maynard Keynes. He was a leading economist. He basically proposed that when after the World War and the Great Depression, which happened, in the 1930s, he basically proposed that the countries need to save money as well. They cannot be just spend economies. There cannot be growth just on the basis of spending by the government. At some stage, the government also needs to have the concept of something called savings. So what happened was, if you recall, after the Great Depression in the 1930s, dollar became the staple currency in the world. And against the dollar, what tended to happen was, he came out with the concept that a country can only print that much currency for which it has gold in its reserves. Okay, just talking about the crux. So this particular concept of, if you've heard about this concept, wherein you normally see a country can only print that much currency notes in terms of which is equivalent to the balance of reserves in gold that the country holds. And there is this concept of something called the forex or foreign capital, you know, or which is what the central banks in most countries, what they look at is they say, okay, we have so much of forex for foreign reserves or forex reserves, and against which what they do is they print currency. Now, this particular concept is basically important is because as the world continues to grow and modernization continues to happen, because of the proliferation of growth and availability of products and services, substitutes, so maybe look at 10 years back, you had only one or two tourist operators offering, travel to say Mecca for Hajj services. But now in Britain, you will look at, there are maybe 200 operators offering such services to Hajj and Mecca, maybe just in the city of London, So because there's so much choice available and there is so much choice available with the consumer, what tends to happen is that the concept of modernization also drives the choice of alternatives with the consumer. And here, according to John Maynard Keynes, what he proposed was that when you look at so much development and modernization when it happens, what you need to do is at some stage you need to restrict this by having some counter mechanisms. So in the case of countries, when they start to print currency, if you have a lot of currency printed and you do not have enough forex gold reserves, then the value of your currency starts falling in the market, right? Imagine if a country like, say, US came back to UK and said, okay, I've got, pounds worth, say, 2 billion in my bank, which I want to exchange and want to give it back to your country. So what will happen is they've got no use of pounds. So the only way that they will make use of pounds will be that they will withdraw that currency from their banks, which is coming in through tourists and others, and they will send it back to the central bank in England, and against which the bank will either need to issue bonds saying that, okay, we owe you so much money, or in exchange, they will need to offer gold, and that value of that currency is again offered against the value of gold, which is then, repatriated back to that particular country when the currency exchange happens. So in the modern day world, currently it is not happening, but what tends to happen is the bonds are issued by the central bank saying that, okay, you have so much of currency available, then in order to underwrite that currency and make that available, what we will do is we will issue you a bond for 10 years, and that 10-year bond yield or the interest rate on the bond will be so much. Okay, now this basically as a concept led to, in general, increase in income levels, savings, and free flow of capital along, around the world, right?
Yeah.
So what happens is when you travel to a particular country, like in the case of Europe, we have euro across all the countries. So it does away with the need for you to carry localized currency, when you're traveling to that location. So this is a concept which has come across because of the, the possibility of adoption of single currency in the euro. Now, if you travel to the States, you have to carry dollar, isn't it? You can pay through, you can carry pounds with you, but at some stage you have to exchange them at the counter to basically buy or get dollars, isn't it? So this is the concept wherein, this was something which was proposed by, John Maynard Keynes, and he basically said that in order for the, the countries to grow, they also need to have savings, and these savings need to be, kind of offset by the value of foreign reserves, foreign exchange reserves, or by the value of gold that the country has in terms of reserves. So that at some stage, if the country goes, bankrupt, or if you have to exchange this currency, then the exchange is possible in the value against that currency by the use of bonds which are issued by the central bank, or in exchange for gold which values against the against that particular currency. Is that okay?
Yes.
And this is something that we study, post the Second World War era, in particular in terms of theories of development. So let's look at recapping. Just to summarize, first thing is when we looked at, before industrialization, and we looked at where, the concept of development was based on three pillars. That means it benefits everybody, it raises the income level of everybody, and you have, choices available and things like that. And that was one of the concepts. Then the second concept that we looked at was Neocolonialism, wherein again, a lot of colonies during the industrialization phase, a lot of countries had lots of colonies. their growth and development was dictated by their country of who was kind of ruling them. So in India, for example, the growth and development was ruled by the British. They decided that whether this will happen or this will not happen. And, till such time India was a colony, they were not able to take decisions, but it was dominated through the colonial power or Britain. Then after the Second World War came the concept of, Keynesian theory, wherein it basically meant that the countries are divided into two types, socialist and capitalist. And when you look at socialists, most of the services are owned by the government. And when you look at capitalists, most of them are owned by the, private individuals or businesses. And here the concept came across was that if development continues to happen or can continue to happen, then in this case, at some stage, the developed countries or the socialist and the capitalist economies need to have enough savings which can offset the cost of development happening in these countries. Right? It's a simple example of this is if you want to get a loan from the bank, when you go to the bank will do a credit check on you and basically look at what is your worth in the market, and according to which they will give you that loan, isn't it?
Yep.
This concept, this kind of a layman's example kind of relates to this particular concept wherein it talks about that my worth is equal to what I get in terms of loan, is what John Maynard Keynes kind of proposed, saying that the country's development has to be kind of offset by the kind of savings it has in terms of in terms of the bank, in terms of the savings that they have at the bank, right?
Yes.
Last but not the least, what we look at is what we want to look at is how do these theories basically look at the concept of development in particular. So just skip slides which are predominantly talking about how development happens and things like that, but going to the important bit, which is how do these affect development within a particular country, and from an aspect of say tourism in particular. What most of these if I look at, say, for example, most of these theories actually propose is some sort of an approach. Either it's a top-down approach or it's a bottoms-up approach. They kind of propose some sort of an approach and a balance between how growth and development can happen within, for example, a particular geography or a country. Now, in some cases, what we do get to see is when the growth and development is happening, it also alters the influence and the balance of power, right? In some countries, what we got to see is that when development was happening, the rich were becoming richer, the poor was becoming poorer, right? This balance of power or balance of equality also gets altered when development is happening in the country.
Yep.
Right? And these inequality or these developments which are happening and leading to some sort of a differentiation in the society can lead to some sort of a discrimination as well. And that is where what we look at is over the years, when this concept of development is happening within countries, there are lots of regulatory bodies which are coming up which try and maintain a balance between what is happening, what is the legitimate reason why it is happening, and how to avoid something which is not supposed to happen, or how to avoid injustice. Okay?
Yep.
Now, an example here would be that within the tourism industry, you see, say, there is a regulatory body who basically looks at, tourism complaints in particular. So when you look at an example that I give you before I go there is when you look at OTHM, for example, this is the regulator which looks after, all the energy providers, and they create the policy. You look at the financial sector, there is something called the Financial Conduct Authority. You look at water industry, there are lots of private companies which are regulating the supply of water in England, and there is a body called the Ofwat, or basically Office of Water Generation, which is a non-governmental body, but it basically looks after everything in terms of fair practices within this sector. Correct? So similarly, when you look at the tourism industry, there is something called the British Hospitality Association, which is BHA. Now that sets the regulation for about 1.8 million businesses which offer such services in the UK as far as tourism and hospitality services are concerned, right? And they also kind of regulate about say 4.5 million people which work within this sector. So when you look at that, when we look at the concept of development and growth, what is also happening with that concept is that there is a regulation which is required, and that regulation which is required also then leads to the creation of certain bodies or let's put it this way, certain boards which kind of regulate this sector so that there is fairness and there is good representation of both the services operator, the services consumer, and also the authority or the bodies which are providing this particular services. Right. So in general, when we look at the concept of development, what we try and then understand from this is we understand that the background which has led to the development because of these theoretical concepts has then created something wherein there needs to be a balance between what is being offered and then that needs to be regulated. Okay. So in summary, what we look at is when we look at these three different types, what we do see is that there is a lot of theories which are available, and some of them have kind of advanced the concept of development, and some of them have created a balance between how development is to be achieved when we look at the sector or an economy in general. Now, the third world, which is basically, the underdeveloped countries, now where most of the natural resources are available, there is a ring fencing which is happening around that is because there is a clear direction which needs to be taken to look at how sustainable development can happen in these countries so that the natural resources are also preserved. So if you look at the Amazon rainforest, when there's a lot of deforestation happening, it is leading to the eviction of a lot of generation of people which have lived within the Amazon forest, right? And this is happening because tourism is also growing, but to a certain extent, there's a requirement for development to happen from a point of view of wood, and that is leading to deforestation. That deforestation is leading to extinction in terms of certain species, and the Aboriginal peoples who are basically inhabitants of the Amazon forest are being evicted out of their natural environment. So now the concept of development being looked at is that there needs to be balance between demand and services, and there needs to be a sustainable development which needs to happen if the government and the policies have to pursue development within the context of environment in general. And that is where what you get to see is that this particular now modern concept is now being put into practice, wherein a lot of countries who are seeking development have been asked to look at sustainable development, have been asked to consider the old theoretical approaches to see and balance and learn from mistakes of what the modernized countries have done, and in a certain aspect try and replicate the goods and adopt the best practices, but also lead into it is also not stopping them from developing, but also lead them into development, but through a better means of development happening in those countries. Okay. Now, this particular learning outcome is basically theoretical, and once this is to understand how the concept of development has happened and shaping up the countries in general over the years. And what we have to look at now is to basically correlate this in the other learning outcomes to how it will relate to tourism in general. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop here today and then send you a copy of this presentation, which is the learning outcome 1, and the other presentation that we covered, which is basically looking at the concept of globalization and how it is shaping up the tourism industry as an overview of this unit. And then what we will do is we will get into the second learning outcome in the next session, which is to understand, the role of government, the role of national, international institutions, the NGOs, in terms of how it is shaping up the tourism sector in general, and how they are leading or contributing to the development of international tourism. Okay.
No problem.
Any questions? What I'll also do is, before I take questions, what I will also do is just to summarize. I'll send you the feedback on the previous assignment with some handouts, and on the theories, the three phases of theories which we have discussed today, the Keynesian and the Taro and the colonialism theories. I will send you a bit of a handout, 2 pages to read, so that you're able to develop this into your assignment as well.
Okay.
Okay. No worries. Any questions so far?
No.
I think it's a bit of a a bit of a